if you remember at the very outset of our study, we sort of divided up the book of Judges into three main sections. So we had the introduction, which introduced us to the conquest of the land, sort of retold the story that's told to us in Joshua. And so the tribes go into the land. They some of them conquer faithfully. They take possession of the land that God had given them. But then we saw this downward spiral, right? Like Judah started well, characters like Othniel, conquering the land, conquering giants, Caleb going in, conquering giants, but then it just goes downhill, where some of the tribes conquer, but they don't completely drive out the Canaanites, and then some other tribes aren't even able to fully conquer, and there's actually more Canaanites in their territory than there are Israelites. And then we got to the very end of that introductory section, and we saw the tribe of Dan, which wasn't even able to conquer anything at all, and were actually driven out of the land by their enemies. So we're actually going to sort of revisit that story, and this is why Judges is sometimes a little bit difficult to read, because chronologically it's not in order. So what these appendices at the end of the book are telling is actually going way back to chronologically going back to the beginning of the story, but they're placed here at the end for a specific reason, which we're going to hopefully explain to you in a little bit. So their placement, I think, serves sort of a fundamental explanation of what's going on in the book of Judges, with the spiral of the people's disobedience, and with the people's failure to conquer. Sort of their role, these appendices, their role is to explain to us, why is all of this happening? What's actually the underlying reasons for this great big mess? And so what we're going to find out is the message of Judges is that when the leaders of Israel, specifically those who were to be their spiritual fathers, when they fail in their task, everything goes wrong, right? Everything goes haywire. And so we find that those leaders, who they are, is the Levites. Okay, the Levites in Israel fail to be the husband to the bride of Israel that they're supposed to be. They fail to be the father to the children of Israel that they're supposed to be. And so when the bride goes sort of whoring after other husbands, we're not surprised when we get to this appendix and we see what the Levites have been doing. Right? It shouldn't surprise us, right? Paul says in Ephesians 5, right? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And so the Levites don't do that. And so the wives, quote unquote, of Israel go looking for a better husband, which they don't find, of course, but they go looking nevertheless. So it was the job of the Levites to manifest God's husbandly attentions to his bride, just as an ignored woman may seek attention elsewhere, so Israel sought other lovers. Okay, again, the point of this message is not to give the people of Israel an excuse for their sin and their idolatry and their whoring after other gods, but it's to point to the underlying reason of why this is even sort of an option in the first place. So Israel was in sin, but the Levites were in greater sin, right? Because their responsibility was greater, right? Just like Adam bore responsibility for humanity's fall, right? Adam and Eve both sinned in the garden, but Scripture tells us that in particular it's Adam's sin that is the reason that we all, subsequently are born into sin. Right? The Lord was to be the husband and the king of Israel, and the Levites' job was to teach that to the people, to manifest that reality to the people, to make his presence known, and they failed at it. And so that's why when we get to the end of the book here in these last chapters in the appendices, it says 5 times, right, there was no king in Israel. And a lot of people, a lot of commentators, I think, misunderstand this saying and the entire intention of the book of Judges. They make it out to be this, Samuel writing this sort of book trying to convince everybody that Israel needs a human king. And the point was, right, God was supposed to be their king, right? We've talked about that. God was to be their king. And because the people were ignoring God and were going after other gods, this is why the author of Judges says there was no king in Israel, right? Because the people weren't paying attention to the one king that they were supposed to have. Everybody was, doing what was right in their own eyes. So this first appendix, chapters 17 and 18 that we're going to look at tonight, shows the consequences of this failure, the failure of the Levites, in the area of worship. And then the second appendix probes the consequences in social life. And that's what we'll look at next Sunday. So this week we're looking at the area of worship. So the structure of Judges 17 and 18 is the familiar structure that we've looked at where God gives a command and a promise to the people, and then the people respond to that either with faithfulness or unfaithfulness or obedience or disobedience, and then God subsequently responds to that faithfulness with blessing, unfaithfulness with cursing. And so again, all of if we don't actually remember that sort of pattern has been used throughout the book of Judges, we'll probably miss it here because it's all sort of in the background, but it's there. So the command and the promise that God is sort of focusing on is the second commandment in particular here, right? Forbidding the worship of God through idols, through graven images. And then the other one has to do with the Levites. So the people had a command and promise, right? Don't worship God with idols, with graven images. The Levites had a more specific command and promise, which was, right, they were to be the guardians of Israel, the priests, guardians of Israel. And so when they fail in that task, what we're going to see is just a bunch of chaos. Okay, and again, so that's the command and promise, and then the evaluation, again, is not so much explicit, right? The judgment that the Lord gives is not explicitly sort of given to us, and the reason for this is that again, chronologically, right, this happens at the beginning of the story. So when we think of, what was God's evaluation of what happened by them, being unfaithful to these commands and promises? Well, the rest, the first 16 chapters of the book of Judges are God's evaluation of it. It's sending the nations to conquer them, to judge them, in the bad way, judge them. So that is God's evaluation of this whole mess. So let's go look at your first section there. We're going to see a false sanctuary. So we'll find as we move through these couple chapters, it does. We will sort of get a climax at the end. Like the story is building up and building up towards something, and so we'll sort of cheat and tell you kind of what we're building up to. We'll tell you right now so you can kind of see it coming. But what it's building up to is the fact that this apostate Levite, this unnamed Levite, in the end, we actually find out is Moses' grandson. It's a direct descendant of Moses who is causing this mess. And which is another reason why chronologically we know that this is right at the beginning, because this is just shortly after the conquest if it's Moses' grandson. But the story it's a parody of the story of the establishment of true worship at the Exodus from Egypt. Virtually every detail found here is also found there, but it's perverted. Okay, so let's read the text. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 17, we'll go down to verse 6. It says, "There was a man of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse, and also spoke it in my ears, behold, the silver is with me. I took it." And his mother said, "Blessed be my son by the Lord." And he restored the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother. And his mother said, "I dedicate the silver to the Lord from my hand for my son, to make a carved image, and a metal image. Now therefore I will restore it to you." So when he restored the money to his mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave it to the silversmith, who made it into a carved image and a metal image. And it was in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household gods, and ordained one of his sons, who became his priest. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So when Micah stole this silver from his mother, she declared a curse, right? She cursed the thief of whoever it was that stole her money, not knowing who the thief was, right? And this is an incredible amount of money, 1,100 pieces of silver. We're told that later on in the story that they're going to hire this Levite and pay him 10 pieces of silver a year for his wages. So we're talking about a huge sum of money here, 1,100 pieces of silver. So I think, she maybe wasn't sure, but I think she had probably a pretty good idea of who may have stolen her money, because she makes sure to sort of whisper it in Micah's ear, right? This curse that she's saying. So Leviticus 5:1 says, "If anyone sins in that he hears a public adjuration to testify, and though he is a witness, whether he has seen or come to know the matter, yet does not speak, he shall bear his iniquity." So she is pronouncing this curse, and she's making sure that he hears it, so that he will, his guilt is multiplied if he doesn't confess, right? If somebody hears about a crime and they're either a witness or a party of it, it actually multiplies, according to the law, their iniquity if they don't confess. And so Micah sort of feels this weight of guilt on himself, and he confesses to his mother, and he returns the money to his mother, and then she sort of undoes the curse by using this blessing, right? "Blessed be my son by the Lord," at the end of verse 2 there. And then, but we also notice that Micah makes none of the required restitution that's demanded by the law of a thief, right? So Leviticus chapter 6, verses 1, starting in verse 1, says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security, or through robbery, or if he has oppressed his neighbor, or he has found something lost and lied about it, swearing falsely, in any of all the things that people do and sin thereby, if he has sinned and has realized his guilt and will restore what he took by robbery or what he got by oppression or the deposit that was committed to him or the lost thing that he found or anything about which he has sworn falsely, he shall restore it in full and shall add a fifth to it and give it to whom it belongs on the day he realizes his guilt. And he shall bring to the priest as his compensation to the Lord a ram without blemish out of the flock, or its equivalent, for a guilt offering. And he shall make atonement for him before the Lord, and he shall be forgiven for any of the things that one may do and thereby become guilty. So the required restitution for a thief, or among other things, right? Not just the specific act of taking something that doesn't belong to you, but any of those related sins against one's neighbor. The required restitution was to give back what you stole plus 1/5, plus 20%, right? And then also to offer a trespass offering at the temple or at the tabernacle to the Lord. So the restitution, right, the added fifth was to satisfy the person that you stole from, the person who was robbed. And then the sacrifice, the trespass offering, was to satisfy God for whom you've sinned against. And so Micah does neither of these things. So he just thinks that he can give back the money to his mother that he stole, and that's good enough. So we can see first, right off the bat, the author here, I think Samuel of the book of Judges, is painting us a picture of somebody who does not care about God's law. So his mother, though, says that what she's going to do, she's going to get the money back, which Micah stole, and she, makes this pledge that she's going to take all of that money and she's going to use it to make a graven image and a metal image, a carved image and a metal image, sort of like in the name of Micah, of her son. But what does she do? It says that she took 200 pieces of silver and gave it to the silversmith. So she's dishonest in the whole thing too, right? So, Micah's covetousness was something that he learned at his mother's knee. So it's the whole situation is just a mess. And then as the text goes on, right, we see that every conceivable kind of idolatry is mentioned here, right? So that we don't miss the point about what's going on and the seriousness of their sin and the seriousness of their idolatry, right? So we have a graven image or a carved image, which would have been a large statue covered with silver. Then we have a metal image or a molten image, depending on your translation. And so this would have been a smaller, portable, solid piece of silver in whatever shape or fashion. We don't know. We're not told exactly what these idols were imaged after. But so we have the larger sort of carved image, which would have been a wooden carved image, but then overlaid with silver. And then we have the metal image, which was a solid silver idol as well. And then we're also told that there was an ephod that was made, in which, if you're kind of familiar with the Old Testament sacrificial system, right? This is the garment, part of the garment of the priest, of the high priest, and it was a device really for communicating with God, asking questions to God, and he would answer through the ephod. Right? It had the 12 stones of the tribes of Israel. It had the Urim and the Thummim, and nobody really knows exactly what those are, but somehow those were used as sort of a yes or no answer to questions that the priest would give to the Lord. And so Micah has one of those as well. He's made one of those, a false version. And then we don't see it here, but a little bit later on, we're also going to see that he's made some teraphim, which are little statues that represent, they're in the form of angels. They represent the heavenly hosts. And then lastly, in this part of the section, we see that Micah has also made his own shrine, or basically his own version of the tabernacle, right? A place for a house for these gods that he has made. So Micah was copying, right, the true worship of Yahweh, of the Lord, and he was just making a sort of perverse copy of all these things, right? He's making these false idols, these false gods. He has the garment of the high priest. He's made his own shrine, his own tabernacle. Now, if, as we're going to see, right, that if the people around Micah, right, if the people in the land were actually obeying and following God's law, Micah would have been executed very quickly, right? This would never fly. But he's not. There seems to be no conflict whatsoever. And again, we are reminded at the end of that section, right? Because there is no king in Israel, everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. So that's the false sanctuary. And then we're going to focus in a little bit in particular on the false priesthood. So let's read verse 7. It says, "Now there was a young man in Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he sojourned there. And the man departed from the town of Bethlehem in Judah to sojourn where he could find a place. And as he journeyed, he came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah. And Micah said to him, 'Where do you come from?' And he said to him, 'I am a Levite of Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to sojourn where I may find a place.' And Micah said to him, 'Stay with me, and be to me a father and a priest. And I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, and a suit of clothes, and your living.' And the Levite went in. And the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. And Micah ordained the Levite, and the young man became his priest, and was in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, 'Now I know that the Lord will prosper me, because I have a Levite as a priest.'" And then the first part of chapter 18 again tells us why this is happening. In those days there was no king in Israel. So the Levite here is called a young man, right? He's just a young man, and until we get to the very end where we find out that this young man is actually the grandson of Moses, the text just keeps calling him a young man, or the Levite, and so. The Levite, right? And I think the reason why is because this young man is supposed to represent the Levites in general, because it wasn't just this young man who was doing these things. It was the entire sort of family of Levites who were committing these atrocities, and the reason that all of this. All the nasty stuff we've seen in the first 16 chapters of Judges is happening. So he's called the Levite, or the young man. And so the Levites, they some of them lived in, right, if you remember, when the tribes went into the land, right, all the 11 tribes got their inheritance, specific portions of land, but the Levites had no inheritance, right? They didn't have there was no land of Levi. And so what happened was the Levites had specific Levitical cities within each tribe, within the land of all the other tribes. And so many of the Levites lived in their Levitical cities, but then the Levites were also supposed to be scattered about throughout the entire nation in all the cities to provide spiritual service. They were basically the local pastors to the nation of Israel, okay, in the cities. And so this particular Levite, right, is sojourning, right, away from one of these Levitical cities, and he's sort of wandering the land looking for his place, looking for someone to take him in that he can serve them. And so he happens upon Micah and his false synagogue here, is his false tabernacle here. So the Levites, they were to be the fathers of Israel, and also represented the divine husband to the bride. So they were fathers and husbands. The Levites had been consecrated to serve the Lord in this capacity as substitutes for the firstborn sons of Israel when the latter failed to lead properly at the golden calf incident. We won't go into that too far, but if you remember the whole incident at the base of the Mount Sinai with the golden calf, right? Moses and Joshua come down. Aaron has led the people into this idol worship of creating this golden calf. The leaders of Israel, the firstborn sons of Israel, had failed to obviously, because they made this golden calf. And so, Moses says, "Who will stand with me?" And it's the Levites who stand with Moses and with Joshua. And because of that, they are given this special privilege, right through the generations, as being the fathers and the husbands of Israel, the ones responsible for taking care of the spiritual needs of God's people. So, however, though, right, if this Levite, again, if we're considering him as sort of the representative of all the Levites, it has perverted the entire job of the Levite, right? His entire ministry is built around this really weird situation of, 1,000 pieces of silver being stolen and returned and turned into idols, and a false tabernacle being built. His entire ministry is built around this false worship. So, like the true Levites, ironically, right? So the Levites were to be a substitute of the firstborn son. It's actually kind of interesting. Micah, remember at the beginning, he says, I'm going to make one of my sons my priest. And so he consecrates one of his sons as priest. And then almost right away, this Levite comes along, and we hear nothing about his son afterwards, but he, boots his son out, and he says, I have a better option. I have an actual Levite who can be priest in my sort of false tabernacle here, and that'll be even better. We have no idea whatever ended up happening to Micah's son, and so this Levite replaces Micah's son. He's a substitute for his son, but again, in sort of a perverted way, not in the proper way, right? The Levites were a substitute for Israel's leaders and firstborn sons in a positive way at the golden calf incident. Here it's in a perverted negative way. But the Levites were not to be, however, sanctuary priests, but local pastors. Okay, there is a difference between a Levite and a priest. Okay, the priests were a separate division, specifically set apart to work in the tabernacle, later on in the temple, to offer the sacrifices. The Levites had a different role. Okay, they were not supposed to be sanctuary priests. They had their job as being sort of these local pastors, teaching the people, providing spiritual leadership for the people. And so this Levite sort of takes on this role that he shouldn't have, right? And so it's really a similar situation. If you remember Nadab and Abihu, who offer strange fire before the Lord, this Levite was doing the same thing, right? He was, it probably looked good, right? They had their ephod, they had their images, they had their tabernacle, but it wasn't done the way God prescribed it to be done. So it was strange fire before the Lord. It wasn't legitimate. And we also see that he's an opportunist, or we're going to see that he's an opportunist, right? So even though it may have been proper for him to leave Bethlehem, right? Because again, some of the Levites stayed in the Levitical cities, but some of them traveled abroad to sort of find a posting throughout the land. He proves that he's not doing it in order so that he can provide spiritual leadership. He's doing it to gain for himself, right? Because he finds this post with Micah, and then we're going to see here just in a minute, like as soon as a better opportunity comes up, he's gone, right? And he leaves Micah in the dust, and he goes with as we're going to see, the Danites here in a little bit. So we also see, I can't remember if I put this, no, I didn't. So just a couple more things. In verse 10, we saw, where was it here? So we saw that they also have a suit of clothes, right? So he pays him the 10 pieces of silver a year, and he also provides him with a suit of clothes. So not only, right, we have the ephod, and then we have this suit of clothes. It's the same, in the Hebrew, it's the same words that are used to describe the garments of the high priest again. So he's fully decked out. He looks the part, but it's it's a perversion of the real thing. So the false Levites of Judges 19. So in the next in the second appendices, we're also going to find out that he comes from Bethlehem as well. So we have this theme of Bethlehem really starting here. This is the first time that Bethlehem is mentioned in this way of really in a negative way, right? We have this Levite coming here. We have the Levite in the next appendix coming from here. We have who is it? Elimelech. How do you say his name? Elimelech. Yeah, Elimelech. Who in Ruth. So again, remember Ruth being taking place during the period of the Judges. So we have Elimelech. Where does he depart from? He departs from Bethlehem on his way to Moab. He's a traitor, and he comes from Bethlehem as well. So we have this really negative outlook of the city of Bethlehem in the book of Judges and in the period of the Judges. And if you know, Bethlehem means house of bread, right? House of bread. And it should have, right, the bread, Bethlehem being in the tribe of Judah, Judah being sort of the royal tribe, the head of the tribes, should have been providing bread for the people, for Israel. Instead, it's just a bunch of defilement coming out of the region of Bethlehem, and it won't, of course, be till this greater, the greater David, the greater son, who comes from Bethlehem, of course, becoming the true bread of life. That this whole theme of defilement coming out of Bethlehem being reversed, and we have true life, the true bread coming from Bethlehem again. And so, if you remember the Philistine who are ridiculed by Samson for essentially believing in magic, like them, Micah also essentially thinks that these images that he's made, these gods that he's made, he has sort of like a superstitious sort of magical view of what they can do, right? He thinks that he can manipulate God by making these idols, by making these images, by doing certain things, and then God will do what he wants him to do. And so we get this statement at the end right where Micah says, now I've got a Levite in my my false tabernacle. Now God is going to bless me, right? Because he thinks that he doesn't actually understand that God wants him to just follow his law and follow and do what he has prescribed. He thinks that all of this is really just, if I kind of cherry pick what I want, right? I've got a Levite. Levites are important, even though they're not supposed to be priests. It's close enough. It's better than my son, right? And so he sticks him in as his priest in his tabernacle. And so he has just this really sort of superstitious understanding of how he can control God. And so he believes now that the Lord will bless him for sure. All right, so I'm going to read, if in your notes you have the next chapter sort of all in one shot. We're not going to read it all in one shot. If you want to flip back and forth, hopefully you've just got your Bibles and you won't have to. But just to save space, it was easier for me to just put it all together there. But let's read... we'll just make this statement first. So the parody continues. So after the Exodus, right, God built his house. Okay, so that's what we see God doing with the building of the tabernacle after the Exodus. Then he invested his priesthood. That's the book of Leviticus. Then the people spied out the land. That's the book of Numbers. And then they conquered it. And then they burnt the first city, Jericho, as Hormah, right, as dedicated to the Lord. That's the book of Joshua. And so this whole timeline, we're actually going to see again replayed now with the tribe of Dan, but in a perverse sort of backwards way. So let me read. I'm not even sure how far I'm going to read, but I'll stop when I feel like it. So verse 1 says, "In those days, the tribe of the people of Dan was seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in, for until then no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. So the people of Dan sent 5 able men from the whole number of their tribe, from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to explore it. And they said to them, 'Go and explore the land.' And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. When they were by the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite, and they turned aside and said to him, 'Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here?' And he said to them, "This is how Micah dealt with me. He has hired me, and I have become his priest." And they said to him, "Inquire of God, please, that we may know whether the journey on which we are setting out will succeed." And the priest said to them, "Go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of the Lord." Then the 5 men departed and came to Laish, and saw the people who were there, how they lived in security, after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth, and possessing wealth, and how they were far from the Sidonians, and had no dealings with anyone. And when they came to their brothers at Zorah and Eshtaol, their brothers said to them, "What do you report?" They said, "Arise, let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. And will you do nothing? Do not be slow to go, to enter in and possess the land. As soon as you go, you will come to an unsuspecting people. The land is spacious, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is in the earth." So these Danites, these faithless Danites, if you were here when we did our study of the introduction of the book, we saw that the Danites were the tribe that failed. They were the ones that utterly failed to take their inheritance. They had no success, and so the text here tells us that that the tribe of Dan, they were still seeking their inheritance. Right, it says in verse 1, "For until then, no inheritance, that they had no inheritance among the tribes," and so they because they had already failed, what they were looking for now was easy pickings. Right, something that they could go in that would, be no trouble, that they could conquer easily, and they could do it by their own strength. Right, because they failed to have faith in God, God did not bless them with victory in the first place, and so because now they're simply relying on their own strength, they have to find something easy to conquer. And so the writer of Judges kind of pokes fun at them by calling these men valiant men, because we're going to see that they're really just a bunch of cowards looking for an unguarded city to capture. And so these valiant men, they're from Zorah and Eshtaol, and that's the same place. If you were here for the last couple lessons with Dan, they were, this Zorah and Eshtaol is the same area that gives us Samson, right? And so we have this sort of comparison by telling us that these men are from Zorah and Eshtaol. We have this comparison of, right, Samson, this man who actually does show real strength, real bravery, right? And then we actually find out that he's actually a descendant of these wimpy, weak, scared little Danites who, want to just, find whatever easy thing they can conquer in their own sort of petty strength that they have. So all the language here is designed to remind us of Moses sending men to spy out Canaan. Moses' spies returned to say that the land was good, but ruled by strong adversaries. These spies are looking for something easy to conquer. So again, opposite, perverse version of what has already happened in the story. So we have Moses sending out the spies. They go in, they see the land is beautiful. It's full of milk and honey, right? Land flowing to milk and honey, but it's full of giants, right? It's too strong. We can't take it. And here we have the opposite, where they have this this land, but then they go in and they say, yeah, it's going to be easy, right? It's an unguarded city. They lack nothing, but they're far away from their people, the Sidonians. They don't see us coming. It's going to be easy. So the whole thing, the way that the author of Judges portrays these men to us is really designed to sort of make fun of them and ridicule them and show them for being weak and a bunch of wusses, basically. So the point of the conquering of the land, remember, was to teach the people how to conduct warfare, right? That was why, right? God could have wiped out the Canaanites before Israel ever got there, but he didn't. He wanted to teach the people how to fight. He wanted to teach the people that there was a fight to be had, right? And so that was why God made them go fight giants. He made them go into a land that was terrifying, right? It wasn't supposed to be this easy. And so they're just these Danites are just showing their faithlessness in wanting to do it that way. So the apostasy of Dan is clearly seen here in these verses. Rather than go to where the tabernacle was located in Shiloh, they ask this false priest, this priest of Micah, to consult his false ephod for an oracle. Right? So instead, of going to Shiloh, where the tabernacle is, in which, if you look at a map, is not even that far away. So they don't even have the excuse of saying, it's on the other side of Israel. It's actually very close to where Micah's false tabernacle was. They go instead to him to ask, are we going to be successful in our battle? Ask God through your false ephod, and of course, he tells them exactly what they want to hear, right? They knew, I think the reason they go to Micah's priest is they probably knew exactly what God's answer would be, right? God would say, no, you're not going to be successful because you're not doing it the way you're supposed to be doing it. This land wasn't even actually part of Dan's inheritance. And so not only that, right, you're trying to sort of circumvent the way that all of this was supposed to happen, right? God would have said, go and conquer the land that I gave you, the one that you already failed to conquer. And so typically, right, like people who don't trust God, apostates of all generations, right, they go and seek out a minister who will sort of tickle their ears, right, and tell them exactly what they want to hear. And so they get the answer that they want. And so the spies return, and their report is just like the report of Moses' spies, except that they encourage Dan to make the move. Again, so like we said, instead of... so in both cases, right, they say the land looks great, it's bountiful, it's prosperous. Moses' spies say, no, it's going to be too tough, we shouldn't do it. These spies come back and say, like, what are we waiting for, right? Why haven't we already gone to conquer them? Right, so the text... stresses that the people of Laish, this land that they're going to conquer, had no defense in order to point out again the cowardice of these Danites. So it's not that the problem wasn't that Laish should have been conquered, right? That land should have been conquered. The problem was that it wasn't part of the Danites' inheritance. So it wasn't up to them to conquer it. Okay, so again, just trying to circumvent the way God had told them that this conquest, should take place. And so they wanted the blessings of the covenant apart from the conditions of the covenant. Okay, they wanted what all the other tribes had, right? Most of the other tribes had at least in part succeeded in getting some of the land of their inheritance. And they wanted that, except they wanted to circumvent the actual ways that God had told them it should happen. So let's keep reading just a couple verses here, verses 11 and 12. Nope, we're at 11 and 12. So it says, so 600 men of the tribe of Dan, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol, and went up and encamped at Kiriath Jearim in Judah. On this account, that place is called Mahenna Dan to this day. Behold, it is west of Kiriath Jearim. So again, we're reminded of Samson, who was from Mahenna. And in order to, again, make this contrast between Samson, an actual mighty man, right, a mighty man of valor, and in comparison to these weakling Danites here. And so let's keep reading verse 13. It says, and they passed on from there to the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. Then the 5 men who had gone to scout out the country of Laish said to their brothers, do you know that in these houses there are an ephod, household gods, a carved image, and a metal image? Now therefore consider what you will do. And they turned aside there and came to the house of the young Levite at the home of Micah and asked him about his welfare. Now the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate. And the 5 men who had gone to scout out the land went up and entered and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, while the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. And when these went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, the metal image, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" And they said to him, "Keep quiet, put your hand on your mouth and come with us, and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be a priest in the house of one man, or to be priest to a tribe and clan in Israel?" And the priest's heart was glad. He took the ephod and the household gods and the carved image and went along with the people. So they turned and departed, putting the little ones and the livestock and the goods in front of them. So, verse 14, right, we get this question, right? And so the question is directed at the Danites, but it's sort of, it jumps off the page to ask us the same question, right? Like, what are you going to do, right? If you were in this situation, what would you do? And it's a good question. And so what do they do? Well, we skipped that. What would they do? Well, they should have, right? If they were actual faithful Israelites to the covenant of God, what they should have done was actually, killed Micah and burned down the house of idols that he was serving in. But that's not what they do. And this passage lists all the false idols over and over again in order to pile up for us a sense of the comprehensive idolatry involved, right? So whatever it was, 4 or 5 times, right? It says, the graven image, the carved image, the ephod, it just lists these things over and over and over again to make sure we don't forget exactly what's going on here. So the Levite rejoices, right, at this new opportunity. Remember we said how he's really an opportunist. So, Micah comes along. He's like, great, I'll get my 10 pieces of silver and do my thing here. And then the Danites come along, right, and he gets his chance to move from his little country church, in the sticks to his big city church with 10,000 people and 3 services, right? His big city tabernacle here with the Danites, and so he jumps at the chance. And while, right, technically, while a move like that might not necessarily be wrong in all cases, it's pretty clear that we're being shown that he's simply just a greedy, in it for himself sort of guy, right? It's his own glory. It's the glory of man, not the glory of God that he seeks. And so realizing, right, these Danites realize that Micah probably isn't going to be happy that they have come and taken his priest and taken his images and taken his ephod. The army actually stays at the rear of the column, and they put the children and the non-soldiers right at the front of the column because they know Micah's coming. So verse 22. If we go back, we'll read verse 22 down to verse 26. It says, verse 22, when they had gone a distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the house near Micah's house were called out, and they overtook the people of Dan. And they shouted to the people of Dan, who turned around and said to Micah, "What's the matter with you that you have come with such a company?" And he said, "You take my gods that I made and the priest and go away, and what have I left? And then do you ask me, what is the matter with you?" And the people of Dan said to him, "Do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry fellows fall upon you and you lose your life with the lives of your household." Then the people of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned back and went to his home. So apparently, at least, there was a little community of sorts that had sort of formed around Micah and his false shrine, his false tabernacle. And so they, Micah and this group of people, they saddle up and they chase after the Danites and their army, right? Because they're angry about what has just happened. And so they didn't want their gods taken away. And, which shows us that man-made gods typically are not very loyal to their makers, it seems. Right? There's a lot of humor and irony here. First of all, if you remember the beginnings of Micah's story, right? He's a thief. He's a crook. He's dishonest. And so now he himself is being robbed of everything that he has. And then, right, even more ridiculous, right? Micah says to himself, "You have taken away my gods, which I made," right? He admits that they're like, these are my gods, but they're just things that I made, which again, right? Man-made gods don't care about who takes them, right? They just go wherever somebody picks them up and takes them. So this is the heart of the idolatry of the people in the book of Judges, right? It's Baalism. And so we talked about Baalism being the idea that, right, so the true idea of worship is that we simply worship God, we do what he commands, we don't do what he commands us not to do, where Baalism is the idea that we can control God, right, through manipulation. We can manipulate God by doing certain things. If we do X, Y, and Z, then God will do X, Y, and Z for us. And so the Danites and Micah here both have this idea, this view of they're essentially Baalists. They're like, oh well, here's some graven images. We can, we'll take Micah's priest and his graven images and his ephod and all these things, and then we'll be able to manipulate God just like he was doing. And then again, kind of just keeping with the humor and the irony of the story, the Danites, when Micah's crew sort of catches up to them, the Danites basically just say, keep your voice down, because there's some really tough fellows, a little bit further up in the column, and if you don't be quiet, they're going to come down and they're going to, beat you up and kill you. There's sort of this like biker gang that says, hey, you better be quiet, or we're going to send in the real tough guys, and they do, right? It works, and Micah realizes that he doesn't stand a chance against an entire army of, entire tribe of people, so he leaves. And that's basically, the end of, the last that we hear from Micah. So verse 27 says, if we can get back to it here, verse 27 says, "But the people of Dan took what Micah had made and the priest who belonged to him, and they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword, and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rahab. Then they rebuilt the city and lived in it, and they named the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish at the first. And the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves, and Jonathan the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up Micah's carved image that he made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh." So, Beth Rahab. Did we get there? Okay, yeah. So Beth Rahab means house of rooms, or a roomy place, a spacious place. And so the Danites, right, they've found this wide open space, and yet they've denounced and renounced God, the Lord, Yahweh, as their giver of wide open spaces. Yaduz is one of the names that God is given in the Old Testament. And so they've just created their own, right? They've gone their own way and done it their way instead of the way God has prescribed. And then we're told that they burned the city with fire. Again, just continuing this theme of basically going through the history of the people of Israel, but doing it in a sort of parody of version of it, right? So when the people came into the land in the first place, they conquered Jericho, and they burnt it as Hormah, as wholly dedicated to the Lord. And so this is what we're told the Danites do here with Laish. It was part of, I can't remember, it was part of the land of Canaan. It was part of Israel's inheritance, but it wasn't specifically Dan's inheritance. So they just wandered, they failed to conquer the land that they were given, and so they were basically just wandering around trying to find the easiest pickings. And I can't remember which tribe Laish actually was originally given to as part of their inheritance. But at the time, these were Gentiles. These were Sidonians. Yeah. So it said, so they're Sidonians who had sort of, because Sidon was on the coast of the Mediterranean, and so they had apparently, this group of Sidonians had wandered a little further in and set up a settlement, and that's one of the reasons why they're such easy pickings. Is that it says they're far from Sidon, right? They have no help. Their brethren are probably don't even know that they've been conquered by the time the battle is over. So these are Gentiles that they're fighting. We're going to get to Israelites fighting Israelites next week in a major way. But for now, it hasn't gotten that bad. It will get that bad though. Where are we here? So they burned the city as Hormah. And so this fire, this time though, right? So the original, when they burned the city of Jericho and other places that were burned as Hormah, the fire that was used was fire from the tabernacle. So this was, symbolizing literally God's sort of destruction of that particular place. It was fire from the altar of the Lord, but this time, right, it's fire from this false tabernacle, this false altar, this false priest. And so it's strange fire, like Nadab and Abihu's fire, which again, one more time, the text tells us, right, that these are a peaceful people, their city is unguarded, and just showing us the sort of, the weakness of the Danites. This is the only place that they can actually conquer is a people who are, have no defense whatsoever. So we read verse 29. So we already, let's just skip down to here. So we get right. So in verse 30, I'm just going to read verse 30 again, because this is sort of the climax of the whole thing. Right, it says, and the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves, and so now we finally get the name of this unnamed Levite, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So the captivity of the land here, we're not talking about the Babylonian captivity or the Assyrian captivity. This is the captivity described at the beginning of 1 Samuel, when the tabernacle is taken by the Philistines into captivity in Philistia, returned shortly thereafter. But so we were given the identity of our Levite here, and it's interesting. It depends on your translation. It may actually not say the son of Moses. It might say, I think it says in some Manasseh. So in many of the what's the word I'm looking for? Manuscripts, because the Israelites were actually so ashamed that this was the case, that the grandson of Moses, this is Moses, right? Like, this is the Israelite, that his grandson was the Levite who was doing this, that they actually changed the name to Manasseh, but because they were so faithful to the text, even though they did that, because they couldn't bring themselves to saying that, they actually put a little note saying that this is in fact what they've done. They put a note in the what's the word I'm looking for? In the margins, saying that this is actually the son of Moses, that they've just changed the name to Manasseh. So just a sort of a weird, interesting fact there. Yeah. yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just, yeah. So they're just admitting exactly what they've done. But again, they just, the idea, the very fact, the very idea of, the grandson of Moses doing this is just too much for them to handle. How are we doing for time here? We're pretty much done. So let's just wrap it up. So basically, in conclusion, right, the whole story is a parody of the history of Israel, and it's a good example of, in general, just the nature of idolatry, right? So it starts with a false exodus. Okay, the Levite leaves his land, leaves his congregation to seek a better place, and it continues with the establishment of a false sanctuary, just like the Israelites did, then a false priesthood, then a false spying out of the land, and then a false conquest. And so it was the job of the Levites, this is your last blank there, the job of the Levites to keep Israel pure by setting forth the true faith. They were to guard Israel as representatives of her true husband. And when they failed, the result was apostasy, idolatry, and corruption. So,
can you explain, again, just to clarify in my own mind, if we were to take these two chapters,
yes,
we would insert them back at the beginning of the book?
Yeah, so these are basically happening at the exact same time as the first, 3 and a bit chapters, during the initial conquest of the land, right? So all the tribes are going in, they're taking their various allotments of the land. We're told in the introduction that Dan fails. They're completely driven out of their land, and then this chronologically is right when this happens. So
he's giving us the experience of the Danites
in particular as an example of why is this whole mess happening in the book of Judges. It's because the Levites have failed, and we're going to see it gets even worse in the second appendix in the last few chapters of the book. So this is, in particular, right, we said how this one shows how they failed in the realm, in the area of worship. And then next time we're going to see how they failed in social life.